And I think it's now my job to pass to the president of the IIC, Chris Chapman.
Thank you, and thank you to your panelists. I just want to know where Chin Ling is, because that background looked fantastic. She says she's in Taiwan, but I have my doubts. Anyway, before we hold our final session for this Asia TMF, we're delighted to have our keynote conversation with Scott Beaumont, who's the president of Asia Pacific for Google. Now, considering the overall theme of this TMF, I think Scott's going to kick off with a look at the move from resilience to resurgence with digital transformation, helping Asia Pacific economies power into a new, indeed roaring economic growth post-COVID. Then, as I understand it, Scott's going to pivot to considering how this greater importance on technology means that we need, I think, more than ever, the right policy and regulatory frameworks in place. And some of that was touched on in the preceding session. And those frameworks need a role for all the digital actors and for governments to come together on what's often referred to as smart regulation. Now, smart regulation is easily said, but what sits behind that necessity is altogether more complex. And finally, I'm hoping that Scott's going to illustrate all of this with some examples of what Google's doing on some of these matters, and on particular the troubling issue of misinformation. So on that note, Scott, there's a number of other things I'd like to tease out, but we're delighted you're with us. Thank you very much, and we look forward to hearing from you.
Thank you, Chris. It's a pleasure to be here. And yes, hopefully the discussion will get to cover everything you just suggested and more. I've been in Asia now for about a decade, and it's been a tremendous experience for somebody in the technology industry. It's really an incredible region full of phenomenal entrepreneurship and energy. You know, over half the world's online population is here in region. 52% of everybody online is here. And that number is only going to increase actually over the next 10 to 15 years, such as the demographic dividend that we've got in Asia. Many youthful countries, that weighting is only going to increase. Even in fact, just the last 2 years during the pandemic, we've had around about 270 million new users come online for the first time. And they're exploring any number of services, including increasingly services which are built here in region, from the region. And that's been, I think, one of the biggest transformations over the last, I'd say 10 years, probably 5 to 10 in the case of China, in the last 2 to 3 in the case of India, and beginning to move elsewhere, where to be a successful entrepreneur, to bring a service to life, you don't need to go to Silicon Valley. It's something actually that you can do from your home market first. The computer science is here in the region. The financing is here in the region. The size and scale of the domestic markets are very large. And the view towards technology is tends to the positive. And so the regulation, the back-end conditions are favourable towards that creation. That's one of the reasons why I think you're going to see such a strong resurgence post-COVID. So on one hand, a very optimistic, high growth view based on facts, but nonetheless, Asia as being the center of quite a lot of innovation. And indeed, we're already seeing it. You look at things like e-commerce, there's more gross merchandise value in e-commerce in Asia than the rest of the world put together. That contributes to a very vibrant digital payments ecosystem. In areas like gaming, which we tend to think is, a bit niche, but actually it's an enormous entertainment industry, likely the future starting point for the metaverse that everyone keeps on talking about. Well, actually, Asia has a very powerful voice, a very powerful community in that world. So Asia at the forefront of technology innovation going forward, I think is definitely one key ingredient worth dwelling on. The second thing, I guess, before we get carried away is technology and digital technologies had a fantastic impact in elevating or being a helpful means of elevating people out of poverty and sharing the benefit of that technology more broadly. It used to be the domain of just multinationals that could engage in international trade. And now it's just as easy for a small and medium-sized business to talk to a customer in Mexico as it is to somebody next door. But that technology doesn't yet stretch as far as it should. Even if you just go to a single country, India, you're probably looking at 400 million people that don't have access to a smartphone. And that number, of course, gets larger the further you go across the region. So how do we make sure that everybody can benefit from the technology which is available? And it goes from the core infrastructure in the beginning. So Google, for example, is involved in literally helping build the backbone of the World Wide Web with cables which go underneath the ocean and link different continents together to make sure that that international connectivity exists. It goes to our investments in data centers, which allows us to run our own services as well as support the services that others use. It goes to our platforms, things like Android, which have helped create individual hardware industries, as well as develop a platform for developers to be able to bring their ideas to life and scale them worldwide. So a large number of different elements need to come together. And all of that's of no use whatsoever unless people know how to use these tools. I came across a statistic actually in a report that we run every year, which is well worth looking at. So that we together with Bain and Temasek, we put together this e-economy report, which deals with Southeast Asia. But there was a survey in it of small and medium-sized businesses in Singapore, and 38% of them said that without digital tools and knowledge to use them, their businesses would have disappeared during the pandemic. And that's an interesting stat, and it makes us happy with the effort that we've made over the last years. In the last 5 years, we've trained 57 million small and medium-sized businesses across the region. And there's more to do. There's more to do. So we need to make sure that people understand how to use this technology. And then the third element is, I guess, making sure that we've got the right guardrails in place for that use. And this is another area where I think that Asia should and can have a strong voice. As I mentioned, a lot of Asia is very positive towards technology. They see it as a key lever to catch up or leapfrog where the West is, to alleviate poverty, to help the development of industry. So that's great, that positive environment, looking towards the possibility of what technology can do and looking to enable that is a great starting point. And then how do we put the guidelines in place to make sure that it can it's continue to be used responsibly? And in the region, places like Singapore, New Zealand, Australia to a degree are leading on the development of digital trade rules. So there's a common understanding in terms of the building blocks that we want to put in place. You look at, you mentioned misinformation. Well, in Australia and Taiwan, we're seeing strong collaborative efforts to try and work through how to deal with misinformation. Or we look at things like counterterrorism and New Zealand's leadership post-Christchurch to make sure that there was a common way of addressing counterterrorism around the world. So I think with that weight of users, with the weight of the economies growing, with that entrepreneurship throughout the region, hopefully we begin to see Asian voices contribute going forward to setting the framework, setting the guidelines out for how society can maximize the benefit of technology, but in the right way. So an exciting area. It's a wonderful region to represent, and I look forward to picking at some of those issues or some others that you've identified, Chris.
Thanks, Scott. There's so much to cover there. I couldn't agree with you more about the potential in the Asia Pacific area for all the reasons you touched on. And I think it will be quickly evident in the next few years about that resurgence. You touched on a couple, I wouldn't mind just continuing that theme for a moment. You touched on the contribution that Google's made in terms of data services and connectivity and the platforms and the hardware solutions it's led to. And then you went to issues of digital citizenship, which are tools and knowledge. And that's all well recognized and appreciated. And it's a virtual circle of benefit for everybody. But then you said something which I listened to keenly. You said there's more to do. There's more to do. And no doubt that's doubling down on those various subheadings you touched on, but presumably there are more expansive things that Google can do and lead on. You might just want to touch on that for a second.
Yes, I mean, there are many different ways of beginning that conversation. I mean, a lot of what we do in partnership with governments throughout the region and NGOs. Clearly, if you've got 270 million people coming online for the first time, ideally you want people to understand actually what to do with that. And so, through programs that we help fund, such as Be Internet Awesome, it's a program for school children to help them understand what the internet is and how to use it and how to protect themselves online. Clearly, with the weight of new users coming online all the time, that's significant. When we speak about the skills that we help small businesses build, that's an ongoing effort. But also, things aren't standing still, right? So when we think about what else is important, that exercise of learning is important. But technology doesn't stand still. And so how then do you make sure that there's a sense of renewal of that learning over time? Famously within Google, one of our most recognized engineering leaders is a chap called Jeff Dean, and he always speaks about a conscious effort to make sure that he is constantly relearning about the technology that we're using on a periodic basis, in order that he can make sure that what we're working on is still relevant. And so that's something we need to be conscious about. But as we also, that's technology changes, but also our attitudes towards technology changes and our knowledge about what we should be doing. And so at the moment, a very vibrant conversation about privacy is taking place. And that's a very different conversation than the conversation that we would have been having when I joined my first mobile internet startup in the year 2000, where we just assumed that the data that was being aggregated might one day be useful, and even if we weren't using it, we would store it carefully just in case a use for it could be identified at a later stage. Now our mindset is very much only to connect what is needed and to make sure actually that there's a check and balance with broader participants in the industry in terms of what makes sense. And then, of course, cybersecurity is top of mind. So I think the question you ask is interesting. I think part of the challenge of trying to work through what the right answers are in terms of how to use technology and what the guardrails are is it's so new, it's so vibrant. New capabilities are being discovered all the time, and user preferences in terms of what is useful and what is acceptable are also in the stage of being formed.
I want to come back to data and privacy and cybersecurity in a moment. Could I just switch, however? You talked about, for example, with digital citizenship and knowledge and tools, you're increasingly going into regions and markets and dealing with governments and regulatory bodies. that is just a small microcosm of the scenario that's before you, that there is not yet any real stitched up smart regulation that adequately works across sovereign states. You know, the world long ago switched from vertical delivery. I mean, Kathy talks so eloquently about those that you license and therefore you can regulate more easily. And then there's those that genuinely cover across international borders. Now, we hear a lot of talk about smart regulation, but I've yet to see a regional or international framework that starts to stitch it together. I just imagine from a Google perspective, it's like whack-a-mole. You know, an issue breaks out in one country and you pour resources into finding a bespoke solution there, and then another country feeds off the back of that. It must be a nightmare, and you're always being reactive, regional, country by country. From a Google perspective, you'd presumably love to see regional or major economy or international frameworks. And on that premise or assumption, what might that look like? What are some of the things you'd like to see in stitched up international cooperation or smart regulation? That's a broad question.
No, that's okay. It's a really fascinating question. It's both as bad as you suggest and it's not. So let's take the glass half full version. And both have elements of truth. Look, the glass half full version is the internet has created an enormous privilege for global businesses to be built. So by and large, and with the odd exception, you can build an idea on the internet anywhere and it will scale to over 200 countries worldwide. And so to a degree, you could argue actually that there is already a global framework in place. I would build on that still further and say, when it comes to how we think about YouTube, how we think about Android, how we think about search, those services are only as good as the user's last decision to use them. And for that to sustain, the service itself needs to have value, but it needs to be trusted. And we need to make the right decisions to protect the health of that product. And so we have a straw man. It's a live straw man. It's changing every day. But we have a straw man of what we think global policy looks like. And that provides a really great starting point with different countries around the world in terms of, here's what we think, here's how we got here, here's why we think it's the right answer, but we're listening. And then it's true what you say. Then you end up having a lot of dialogue in many different places from many different perspectives, oftentimes on problems that you may not have seen before. Sometimes you can pattern match, and then you try and find a way of holding holding consistency, because that consistency is key if you want to continue to have a World Wide Web which allows innovators to scale and operate in as a frictionless environment as possible. But there are times when not everybody agrees, and that is a challenge. But it is also possible, and I mentioned the counter-terrorism post-Christchurch conversation that New Zealand led. It is possible also on a number of issues to get to a common point of view if there's sufficient clarity on the goal and a determination to see it through. So I would hope for more of those kind of conversations. I would hope for a broader framework of agreed digital trade frameworks between countries that allow for that consistency, because it is, it's time consuming, sometimes difficult, when you end up trying to answer the same question, but feel like you're being pulled in 6 different ways to do it. And that's not a complaint. As I say, right, this is part of trying to understand what the right guidelines are and how things should be shaped going forward, and trying to get to consensus. But I think we can do a good job, I hope, in explaining what our straw man looks like and why. And hopefully governments can also do a good job by creating a high degree of alignment in what good looks like, so that there's a common space with hopefully very few, a single answer at best, but very few variants in between.
What sort of response? That's fascinating. The straw man, good policy or best practice or whatever. What sort of responses do you get to that? I assume it varies dramatically from wow, that's wonderful and intelligent, to oh Christ, I never thought of that.
Well, I think people have generally thought of these things. Generally, the dialogue we have, is good and strong. People are generally motivated from a good place, right? We may not agree sometimes in terms of what the answer is, but the motivation is, generally from a good place to find the answer. And I think it's always good, isn't it, to understand. If you're trying to partner with somebody to get to a good answer, understanding what that partner thinks and why is, a valuable piece of input. And even if you disagree, you've got a stronger leg to stand on in terms of why you disagree, and that dialogue's a good thing. I think on a number of these issues, I think sometimes where things get a little bit bent out of shape is you forget you're trying to solve for several counterparties at the same time. So it's important to think, on a topic like privacy, actually what you're trying to solve, what's best for the end user, what makes sense for the publishers, what makes sense for the economy and society generally. And sometimes you can get a little bit too focused on one of those elements. But that's unfortunate, because actually you need to solve for all of it at once. And I think generally the conversations that we have, the best conversations that we have are ones that look at how we've approached that to date. And we're also very happy to listen to how others have approached it, because we've tried to solve it for all of those different constituents. And we may not have the right answer, but it's a good try. And so if we're going to move, this is how we got there. So if you want us to move, what did we get wrong? And, Google being quite a logical organization, that kind of conversation's quite useful. And that period of, uncovering why we think the way that we think and the way that we think that we've solved it is often valuable in then teasing out actually where do the refinements need to take place, where do the iterations need to take place, where do we fundamentally disagree, which is rarer than you think, but that's always useful to bring out into the open too whenever that's the case.
That's equally interesting. You touched on something about 5 minutes ago where you talked about trust in the system, trust in and engendering trust makes the world go around and provides for consistency and sustainability. And that trust in many ways is a reflection of adequate, efficient redress that a consumer or a user or a citizen, depending on what guise they're operating in, gets out of the system. It's in Google's interest, it's in everyone's interest, it's in the big players' interest for there to be confidence and faith and trust in the system. And the avenues for redress are getting better, but I assume that's a focus for Google, and one that's readily acknowledged as where you've got to continue to do more and more, and it's eternal vigilance. Do you want to comment on that?
Yeah, I mean, I think what you say is spot on. I mean, at one level, Google is nothing without people that actually use the services that we provide, whether those are end consumers or any myriad of number of different partners. If there's no trust in the service, there's no trust in what we're offering, then we're gone tomorrow. At the same time, I think also when we're speaking to whether it's industry bodies or whether it's governments, I mean, always I think that dialogue is much stronger if there's a degree of trust in them. If you can't have faith in what somebody is saying, then that dialogue is going to break down pretty quickly. And the common goal, which hopefully we have, which is how do we maximize the benefit of the technology that we have available to us, but in a way which makes an awful lot of sense. And it will be, it takes a community of different perspectives to come together to find the right answer. I think this is common to any new technology. I often think back to when the motor car was first created, and the first one of the early attempts at good regulation was having somebody with a flag walk in front of the car, and that really wasn't making the best use of the technology that was available. But if you begin a process where you listen to and you respect the views of the motorist, the pedestrian, the car manufacturers, the highway builders, legislators, whatever it happens to be, you can come up with a stronger answer which looks to maximize the benefit of that technology on society as a whole in the many different areas in which it may lead. And then you get a highway code which is built by many hands, and clear rules and penalties when required if people don't follow them. And so, I mean, even when I think back to the businesses that I built before I joined Google, they were built on partnership. And inherent in any partnership, you need that. Even when you disagree with people, even when you're competing with people, I think if you can find a respect for different points of view and different perspectives, then you can build bridges. And so, that has to be, I think, at the beginning of every conversation. And hopefully, we have many different examples of partnerships with governments across the region in any number of different fields. And hopefully, even in those instances where, we don't quite agree on how things, should transpire, the fact that we clearly have a motivation to ensure that we are around for a long time requires us to serve end users with respect, to serve our partners with respect, to build, great services. And so governments, should see us as a motivated partner to make sure that that technology is used in the right way. And I think by and large that's true.
Listen, I should have lent on our program organisers to give me another half hour with you, because we're already out of time. But they shortchanged me. On a slightly more whimsical note, projecting forward, you talked about the highway. Let's switch that. What's coming down the highway in the next 10 or 20 years as themes that we society, we the digital actors, we regulators need to think about? Just leave us with one or two thoughts, and then we'll have to wrap it up there, my friend.
Yeah, so I would say, climate change is top of mind for all of us. Google's been very aggressive, and we're slightly nervous about it, even though we think it's the right thing to do. We're not sure how we're going to get there. We said we're going to be carbon free by the end of the decade. That's going to take a continuing kind of 1%, 0.5%, 2% changes incrementally, but also a couple of step changes in technology that we don't quite see the path towards yet. But technology, in conjunction with a number of other factors, I think is going to be necessary and important in how we all collectively overcome that challenge. So that's one area.
Right.
Yeah, and I think we're going to continue, to explore the capability of things like AI and machine learning, and I think some of the breakthroughs that we're going to see there are going to be significant for us too.
Anyway, thank you for joining us today. It's been we've just scratched the surface, but it was very interesting to listen to you. Thank you for your participation.
My pleasure. Thanks very much for the invitation.